Operation Citadel ended the way a German armored offensive was never supposed to end: stalled, bled out, and strategically inverted. July 1943. Adolf Hitler's command drives Panzer spearheads into the Kursk salient, expecting the familiar logic: break the line, restore tempo, reclaim initiative. The Soviet Stavka, with Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky shaping the response, does something colder. They do not race to preempt the blow. They prepare to absorb it. They let the enemy hit the obvious place, at the obvious time, and then watch Germany's best formations grind into a defense built like a machine. Why would a command choose to be struck first? What assumption about German doctrine did they bet their war on? And what happens if that assumption is wrong? This episode is not about who had more tanks, more men, or better commanders at Kursk. It is about a decision that should not exist in standard military logic. The strategic problem facing the Soviet High Command in mid-1943 was brutally simple. Germany would attack the Kursk salient. The direction was predictable. The timing was narrowing. The method, armored penetration, was almost guaranteed. The orthodox response would have been to disrupt that attack before it formed. Strike first. Break concentration. Force the enemy to react. Instead, the Soviets chose something far more dangerous. They designed a strategy that depended on being attacked. Not as a contingency. Not as a fallback. But as the core mechanism of victory. This was unorthodox not because it was clever, but because it was fragile. It required absolute confidence in one thing: that the enemy would think exactly the way they always had, and would be unable to stop themselves from doing so again. If German command hesitated, adapted, or refused the bait, the entire structure would collapse. The Red Army would be locked into a static defense it never intended to fight on indefinitely. So before we examine how this plan was built, we need to understand the environment that made such a reckless idea feel necessary. Because only when every conventional option is quietly closing does a strategy this abnormal become imaginable. By the spring of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had entered an unstable pause. The catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad had shattered the illusion of inevitability, but it had not destroyed Germany's ability to fight. What it destroyed was certainty, on both sides. The Soviet Union now faced a paradox. It had survived. It had regained momentum. But it was not yet strong enough to end the war quickly. Germany, meanwhile, was wounded but dangerous. Its industrial output was recovering. Its armored forces were being rebuilt, re-equipped, and concentrated. And more importantly, its command still believed in a familiar solution: restore the initiative with a decisive blow. That blow was aimed at Kursk. On the map, the Kursk salient was an anomaly, a bulge protruding westward into German lines. It invited attack. It practically demanded it. For German planners, this shape suggested a clean operational problem: pinch the salient from north and south, encircle Soviet forces, destroy them, and reset the front. It fit perfectly into the mental template German command had relied on for years. For the Soviets, the same shape represented a trap, but only if it could be turned into one. The difficulty was that every factor surrounding Kursk worked against conventional Soviet responses. First, geography. The terrain offered no dramatic natural barriers. No rivers to anchor on. No mountains to block armor. The open fields favored mobility, firepower, and speed, German strengths. Second, time. German preparations were visible. Soviet intelligence had a rare advantage: it knew an attack was coming. But knowing that an attack is coming is not the same as knowing how to stop it. Preemptive action would require rapid concentration and coordination across vast distances, something the Red Army still struggled to execute cleanly. Third, logistics. After years of attrition, Soviet industry could now produce in enormous volume. But distribution remained uneven. Rail lines were strained. Units were uneven in quality. Launching a large-scale offensive prematurely risked burning resources faster than they could be replaced. Fourth, political pressure. Soviet leadership could not afford another spectacular failure. The memory of 1941 and 1942 was still raw. Any strategy that looked aggressive but collapsed early would have consequences far beyond the battlefield. And finally, morale. The Red Army had learned to fight, but it had also learned how easily momentum could turn into catastrophe. A failed offensive could undo months of psychological recovery. Against this backdrop, the standard military playbook began to look less reliable. A preemptive strike sounds bold until it fails. A mobile defense sounds flexible until it loses coherence under pressure. An immediate counteroffensive promises initiative until it exposes weak coordination. Every orthodox solution carried hidden risks that were difficult to control. Meanwhile, German command faced its own constraints, and these mattered just as much. Germany needed a victory that looked decisive. Not a slow grind. Not a positional struggle. A clean operational success. This was not just military logic. It was institutional logic. German doctrine, officer culture, and command prestige were all tied to the idea that armored forces could break deadlock through decisive penetration. To abandon that belief would be to admit that the war had fundamentally changed, and that admission carried political and psychological costs few were willing to pay. There was also an industrial clock ticking. Germany could still build advanced tanks, but not in unlimited numbers. A long war of attrition favored the Soviet Union. The only way out was to force the Red Army into a battle that destroyed its capacity faster than it could be rebuilt. From the Soviet perspective, this created a rare asymmetry. Germany needed to attack Kursk. The Soviets did not need to rush to stop them. This difference in necessity created a strategic opening, but a narrow one. Because turning Kursk into a killing ground required accepting a deeply uncomfortable truth, the Soviets would have to absorb enormous punishment before they could impose control over the battle. This is where most narratives soften the edge. They talk about preparation, defenses, depth. They avoid the core implication. The Soviet plan did not aim to avoid losses. It aimed to structure them. This was not a failure of imagination. It was a deliberate choice to trade space, blood, and endurance for time that would erode German strength at a rate Germany could not sustain. But this choice depended on one dangerous assumption. That German command would do what it had always done. That it would commit its best armored forces into the salient. That it would double down when progress slowed, rather than step back and rethink the entire operation. If Germany hesitated, adapted, or simply refused to play its expected role, the Soviet position would become precarious very quickly. A prepared defense that is not attacked becomes a liability. A force built to absorb blows cannot remain static forever. So the battlefield was set, but the real battle was cognitive. It was a contest between two strategic belief systems. One side believed initiative came from movement and penetration. The other was betting that initiative could be seized by letting the enemy move first, and then breaking the logic that made that movement possible. At Kursk, the question was not who had the better tanks. It was whose understanding of war would prove more rigid. And inside that tension, a decision began to form, one that rejected the textbook, defied instinct, and turned the act of being attacked into the center of a strategic design. Military doctrine does not forbid caution. But it is deeply suspicious of waiting. In 1943, the Orthodox response to an imminent enemy offensive was clear. If you know where the blow is coming, you disrupt it before it lands. There were variations of this logic, but they all shared the same instinct. You strike the enemy while they are concentrating. You force them to deploy early. You deny them tempo. In theory, this approach preserves initiative and reduces casualties. In practice, it assumes something crucial, that you can execute faster and cleaner than the enemy expects. For the Red Army in mid-1943, that assumption was shaky. A preemptive Soviet attack against German armored concentrations would have required near-perfect coordination across fronts, rapid exploitation, and a level of operational fluidity the Red Army was still developing. A partial success would not be enough. A stalled offensive would simply hand Germany the very battle it wanted, but on worse terms. There was also a doctrinal temptation, the mobile defense. This approach promised flexibility. Let the Germans break in. Then counterattack with reserves once their spearheads overextend. On paper, this seemed safer than static defense. It avoided the optics of sitting still. It preserved maneuver. But here, the terrain worked against it. The Kursk region did not offer the kind of depth or natural obstacles that made mobile defense forgiving. A mistimed counterstroke could expose flanks, fracture command control, and create cascading failures, exactly the kind of chaos German armored doctrine thrived on. Then there was the most seductive option of all, immediate counteroffensive. After Stalingrad, there was pressure, political, psychological, symbolic, to keep pushing. To prove that the tide had turned permanently. But an early offensive would have collided with a hard reality. German armored forces were not yet broken. They were waiting. Launching an offensive into an enemy who is prepared, concentrated, and doctrinally optimized for counterblows is not initiative. It is acceleration toward risk. Each of these textbook options shared a hidden flaw. They all tried to outmaneuver Germany at the exact moment when Germany still had relative advantages in maneuver warfare. They also underestimated something subtler. German command did not merely plan to attack Kursk. It needed Kursk to behave in a certain way. It needed a battlefield where armored penetration still made sense. Where concentration led to decision. Where persistence would eventually be rewarded. The Soviet High Command understood this dependency. And this is where the textbook quietly breaks down. Standard doctrine treats defense as a means to delay or preserve force. It rarely treats defense as the primary weapon. Yet at Kursk, every offensive alternative ran into the same wall. Strike early, and you risk collapsing your own momentum. Stay flexible, and you risk being forced into improvisation under armored pressure. Attack aggressively, and you risk confirming German expectations instead of disrupting them. In other words, if the Soviets followed the textbook, they would be playing on Germany's preferred terrain, conceptual, not just geographic. This created a strategic contradiction. Germany needed a decisive armored battle. The Soviets needed time, attrition, and doctrinal erosion. But time could not be purchased cheaply. The only way to gain it was to endure. This is the moment where conventional military thinking becomes uncomfortable. Because the alternative that began to emerge was not elegant. It was not clean. And it violated one of the deepest instincts of command: avoid being hit if you can help it. The emerging idea was this: if Germany insists on attacking, then the attack itself must become the mechanism of its own failure. Not by clever feints. Not by last-minute counterstrokes. But by forcing German armored units to advance into a battle space engineered to consume them slowly, predictably, and irreversibly. This required abandoning the hope of an early decision. It required accepting that the opening phase of the battle would look like loss. Positions would be overrun. Units would be destroyed. Commanders would report setbacks that, in any other context, would trigger emergency intervention. And this is precisely why most commanders would reject such a plan. Because it demands faith in an outcome that only appears after the damage is done. Textbooks are written to reduce uncertainty. This approach embraced it. Even worse, it inverted the moral arithmetic of command. Losses were no longer signals of failure. They were inputs into a larger design. That is a line many systems cannot cross without breaking. So the problem was not that the Soviet leadership lacked conventional options. It was that every conventional option carried risks they could not control. What they began to explore instead was a strategy that did something far more radical. It treated German doctrine as a predictable machine. And instead of trying to disrupt it, it built a battlefield that would force that machine to operate at maximum stress until it failed. This was not a tactical idea. It was a systemic one. And it did not originate from optimism. It emerged from a cold assessment that Germany could still strike hard, but could no longer sustain the consequences of striking blindly into prepared depth. The textbook did not forbid this approach. It simply did not teach it. Because no doctrine is comfortable explaining how to plan for loss before planning for victory. And that is why the next step was not about execution, but about belief. Who dared to propose this idea, who resisted it, and why accepting it meant crossing a psychological line that could not be uncrossed. The decision did not emerge as a dramatic revelation. It formed slowly, under pressure, through elimination rather than inspiration. Soviet senior command was not asking, what is the most elegant way to win? They were asking a narrower, colder question: which option leaves the fewest variables we cannot control? Within the Stavka, the debate was not about whether Germany would attack Kursk. That was already accepted. The argument centered on timing, posture, and initiative. Some voices favored limited spoiling attacks to disrupt German preparations. Others argued for mobile defense, preserving flexibility and avoiding the optics of static lines. These were not naive proposals. They were reasonable, doctrinally sound, and politically safer. What pushed the discussion in a different direction was not confidence, but distrust. Distrust in the Red Army's ability to execute complex offensive maneuvers faster than the Germans. Distrust in coordination under pressure. Distrust in the idea that initiative could be seized simply by moving first. The unorthodox option began as a negative conclusion: if we cannot reliably outmaneuver them, then we must outlast them. And if we must outlast them, then we must force them to expend strength in a way that cannot be recovered. This is where the first core assumption appeared. German command would not abandon the logic of armored penetration, even when progress slowed. Not because they were foolish, but because their entire operational culture was built around the belief that persistence in breakthrough leads to decision. To stop pushing would be to admit that the war had entered a form Germany was structurally unprepared to fight. The second assumption was more dangerous. Soviet forces could endure losses at a scale that German forces could not replace quickly enough, provided those losses were structured rather than chaotic. This was not an emotional judgment. It was an industrial and demographic calculation, filtered through brutal wartime reality. The third assumption was psychological, and the most fragile of all. German command would interpret Soviet defensive preparation not as a trap, but as confirmation that Kursk was the correct place to strike. The more visible the defenses became, the more they would appear as a challenge to be overcome rather than a warning to disengage. These assumptions did not go uncontested. There were fears that a static defense would ossify command thinking. That it would invite encirclement if breached. That it would lock Soviet forces into a posture that could not adapt if German plans changed. There was also the unspoken concern: how does one justify, in advance, a plan that requires absorbing catastrophic losses before results appear? This was the psychological barrier. Accepting the plan meant accepting that early reports from the front would be grim. That success would not be visible in the first days. That the signal to continue would be endurance, not progress. At a strategic level, the decision was not about defending Kursk. It was about attacking German decision-making. The battlefield was chosen not just for geography, but for symbolism. A salient invites closure. It invites the belief that it can be cut off, reduced, solved. By choosing not to remove the salient, the Soviets turned it into bait. By fortifying it openly, they framed it as a test of German armored credibility. And by refusing to preempt the attack, they preserved the one thing Germany needed most: the belief that decisive action was still possible. This was the inversion. The Soviet plan did not aim to confuse German command. It aimed to reassure it. To keep it comfortable enough to proceed. To prevent hesitation. Once that logic was accepted, everything else followed. Defense was no longer about holding ground. It was about regulating the rate at which German strength was consumed. Time was no longer an enemy. It became the main weapon. But this decision also created a point of no return. A force built to absorb blows cannot improvise its way out if the blows come differently than expected. If Germany paused. If it diverted effort elsewhere. If it refused to commit fully. At that moment, Soviet command would be exposed, locked into depth without motion, bleeding without payoff. This was not boldness. It was calculated exposure. A strategy that only works if the enemy behaves exactly as predicted. Which leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. How do you turn a plan that depends on loss into something that can actually function under fire, across hundreds of kilometers, with millions of men? That question takes us out of the planning room and into execution. Into logistics, engineering, command discipline, and the fragile mechanics that determine whether a design survives first contact with reality. Because once the decision was made, there was no room left for improvisation, only for endurance, precision, and the acceptance that if any critical component failed, the entire strategy would collapse from within. Once the decision was locked in, the problem shifted from theory to survival. A strategy that depends on being hit first only works if the force being hit does not break. At Kursk, execution was not about brilliance. It was about eliminating failure points before the battle even began. The first transformation was conceptual. Soviet defense was not organized as a line, but as a process. Multiple defensive belts were constructed with a single purpose: to regulate German momentum. Each layer was designed to slow, disorganize, and tax attacking formations just enough to force them to commit further resources. Breakthrough was anticipated. It was budgeted. What mattered was not whether the Germans penetrated, but how much strength they burned to do so. This required an industrial approach to battlefield preparation. Minefields were not symbolic obstacles, they were tools for time management. Engineering units worked to ensure density, redundancy, and coverage, knowing that clearing operations would force German armor to halt, bunch up, and expose itself. Artillery was pre-registered not for dramatic barrages, but for repeated, grinding fire that punished predictable movement corridors. Logistics became the hidden center of gravity. Ammunition stockpiles were positioned not for flexibility, but for endurance. Repair and recovery units were integrated into defensive planning, allowing damaged vehicles to be pulled back, fixed, and returned without collapsing unit cohesion. Medical evacuation was not an afterthought, it was a requirement for sustaining morale in a battle where early losses were guaranteed. Command discipline was equally critical. Local commanders were under strict orders to resist the instinct to counterattack prematurely. This was unnatural. Every tactical training instinct pushes leaders to strike back when the enemy stalls. At Kursk, doing so too early would feed reserves into a fight still dominated by German armored strength. Restraint became a command virtue, enforced through rigid control of reserves. The system only worked if every component synchronized. Mines without artillery were insufficient. Artillery without infantry protection was vulnerable. Infantry without logistical flow would collapse under pressure. There was no margin for improvisation. The plan demanded obedience to design over reaction to circumstance. This rigidity created obvious risks. A breakthrough at the wrong point could cascade. If German forces achieved operational penetration before their momentum degraded, Soviet depth could become a liability rather than a buffer. There was also the danger of misreading exhaustion. If German units appeared slowed but retained striking power, committing reserves at the wrong moment could turn attrition into annihilation. Several moments brought the strategy close to failure. Local penetrations created pressure for immediate response. Reports from the front described collapsing positions, mounting casualties, and lost ground. In another context, these signals would trigger a doctrinal shift. At Kursk, they were interpreted against a different metric: is German combat power being consumed at the expected rate? This was the most unnatural aspect of execution. Progress was not measured in kilometers gained or lost, but in the degradation of enemy capability. Tank losses, crew fatigue, logistical strain, command hesitation. These were the indicators that mattered. The micro-twists of the battle were not sudden reversals, but near misses. Moments when German units pushed slightly deeper than planned. Moments when Soviet countermeasures lagged. Moments when the temptation to abandon the design almost overpowered the discipline required to sustain it. What kept the system intact was not optimism, but inertia. Once the machine was built, changing course would have been more dangerous than staying on it. The cost of reversal was higher than the cost of continuation. By the time German command began to sense that something was wrong, the trap was already closing. Their forces were advancing, but not accelerating. Progress existed, but it was expensive. Every gain demanded disproportionate effort. And yet stopping felt impossible. Too much had already been invested. This is the paradox of the execution phase. The Soviet plan did not need to surprise Germany. It needed to keep Germany moving forward just long enough for exhaustion to become irreversible. The defense held not because it was invulnerable, but because it was designed to fail slowly. And in war, failure at the right pace can be more lethal than success at the wrong one. But execution alone does not decide a battle of this scale. What ultimately determines success is how the enemy interprets what is happening, and whether they recognize the trap before it is too late. German command did not walk into Kursk blind. They knew the Soviets were prepared. They knew defenses were deep. What they did not grasp was the purpose of that preparation. They interpreted Soviet readiness through their own doctrinal lens, and that lens distorted every signal that followed. From the first days of Operation Citadel, German reports described slow progress, heavy resistance, and rising losses. None of this was unexpected. In fact, it was interpreted as confirmation that the main effort was correctly identified. A strong defense meant a valuable objective. Difficulty validated the choice to attack rather than questioning it. This is the first cognitive lock. German doctrine equated resistance with importance. If the Soviets were willing to defend Kursk at such cost, then Kursk must be decisive. The idea that the defense itself was the weapon did not fit the mental model. As progress slowed, German command did what it had always done. It reinforced success. More armor was committed. More pressure applied. Breakthrough was assumed to be a matter of persistence. Each delay was treated as temporary friction, not structural failure. This response was shaped by institutional habit. German armored warfare had been built on the belief that once contact was made, withdrawal or pause was more dangerous than pushing through. Momentum was protection. Hesitation invited counterattack. So even as losses mounted, the instinct was to press harder, not reassess. Information flowed, but interpretation lagged. Reports emphasized terrain difficulty, Soviet stubbornness, and isolated tactical problems. What was missing was synthesis. No single report said, "This battle is designed to consume us." And without that framing, each setback remained manageable in isolation. There was also command rigidity. Decisions required justification upward. Calling off the offensive would not just be a military choice, it would be an admission that armored dominance no longer guaranteed results. That was a political and psychological threshold German leadership was reluctant to cross. The critical mistake was temporal. German command assumed time favored them, that prolonged pressure would eventually crack Soviet defenses. In reality, time was the variable working against them. Every hour of stalled advance drained combat power faster than it could be replaced. Every destroyed tank was not just a loss, but a loss of trained crews and maintenance capacity. The point of no return was subtle. It did not arrive as a dramatic collapse. It appeared when German units were still advancing, but no longer dictating terms. When operational initiative narrowed to tactical persistence. When command decisions became reactive rather than directive. By then, withdrawal was no longer a clean option. Too much strength was committed forward. Too much prestige invested. The offensive continued not because it made sense, but because stopping seemed worse. This is where the Soviet gamble paid off. The Germans did not misread one signal. They misread the structure of the battle itself. They believed they were fighting resistance. In reality, they were being processed. And by the time this realization began to surface, the strategic window had closed. What followed was no longer a contest of maneuver, but of exhaustion, one that Germany could not win. Which brings us to the outcome, and the question that history often avoids: even if the strategy worked, what did it truly cost, and what would have happened if just one assumption had failed? By the time Operation Citadel lost momentum, the outcome was already decided in structural terms, even if it was not yet visible on the map. German armored formations had not been annihilated in a single stroke. They had been reduced through accumulation. Loss by loss. Delay by delay. Decision by decision. The immediate result was strategic inversion. Germany failed to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The offensive power concentrated for Kursk could not be reconstituted quickly, if at all. What followed were Soviet offensives that encountered an opponent no longer capable of setting the terms of engagement. From that point forward, Germany reacted more than it acted. But this description risks smoothing over the reality on the ground. The Soviet victory at Kursk did not feel like a triumph in its opening phases. It felt like controlled damage. Entire units were consumed holding ground they were never meant to keep permanently. Positions were lost by design, but that design still required men to stay in place until overwhelmed. Casualties were not accidental. They were anticipated. This is the part most narratives soften. A strategy that turns attrition into a weapon must accept attrition as payment. Soviet losses were severe. Not just in numbers, but in human continuity. Experienced soldiers were replaced by new ones trained under pressure. Psychological strain accumulated in formations ordered to absorb punishment without immediate relief or visible success. There was also a logistical cost that rarely receives attention. Maintaining defensive belts under constant attack required continuous replenishment of ammunition, engineering assets, medical support, and replacement equipment. Any serious disruption could have cascaded into collapse. The margin for error was thin. Politically, the strategy carried its own risk. Had the German attack broken through more deeply, or had Soviet reserves been committed at the wrong moment, the resulting losses would not have been explainable as part of a plan. They would have appeared as catastrophic miscalculation. Success retroactively legitimized the decision. Failure would have condemned it. The psychological burden on command was equally heavy. Choosing not to intervene early, knowing that losses were mounting, required a level of detachment that is difficult to sustain. It demanded trust in abstract indicators rather than visible progress. Few systems tolerate that kind of delayed validation. Which raises the counterfactual that defines how narrow this victory truly was. If German command had paused earlier, if it had shifted effort away from the salient, if it had refused to commit its best formations once resistance stiffened, the Soviet defense, optimized for absorption, could have become an exposed liability. Depth without pressure is not protection. It is immobilization. The strategy worked because its assumptions held. German doctrine remained rigid. German leadership persisted. German forces continued to invest in a battle that was designed to drain them. That does not make the strategy inevitable. It makes it conditional. The uncomfortable truth is that this was not a plan that guaranteed victory. It was a plan that maximized the probability of a specific failure, on the enemy's side, at the cost of accepting immense risk and loss. Kursk was not won because the Soviets found a safer way to fight. It was won because they chose a way of fighting that aligned brutality, endurance, and prediction into a single system. The question that remains is not whether this was effective. History answers that clearly. The question is whether this kind of strategy represents insight or necessity. Whether it reveals genius, or simply the limits imposed by industrial war, doctrine, and power structures that leave commanders with only one viable path. And that leads to the final task, to step back from Kursk itself and ask what this strategy actually teaches us about war, not as a series of battles, but as a system that rewards certain ways of thinking and punishes others. Strip Kursk of its tanks, its maps, its numbers, and what remains is not a battle. It is an argument about how wars are decided when maneuver stops being decisive. The Soviet strategy before Kursk was not primarily about defense, deception, or even attrition in the narrow sense. It was about predictability as a weapon. The core insight was that German command was no longer flexible enough to escape its own logic. Armored penetration was not just a method, it was an identity. Once committed, it could not be abandoned without psychological and institutional collapse. This is the first principle the strategy exposes. In mature wars, the enemy's doctrine becomes a constraint more powerful than terrain. The Soviets did not defeat German tanks by outgunning them. They defeated German decision-making by designing a situation in which the correct doctrinal response was strategically wrong. The second principle is more disturbing. Initiative does not always belong to the side that moves first. At Kursk, initiative belonged to the side that controlled the meaning of time. The Red Army accepted tactical passivity in exchange for strategic leverage. Losses were not signals of failure, they were indicators that the system was functioning. This inversion only works when command can detach from short-term optics and tolerate delayed confirmation. Most military systems cannot do this. Not because it is illogical, but because it is politically and psychologically corrosive. It asks leaders to accept suffering without visible progress, and to trust abstractions over immediate outcomes. Kursk worked because the Soviet system could absorb the tension without fracturing. The third principle concerns deception. Maskirovka here was not concealment. It was alignment. The Soviets did not want Germany to misunderstand the battlefield. They wanted Germany to understand it exactly as German doctrine encouraged. The deception lay in allowing the enemy to see the truth, but only the part of the truth that fit their expectations. This reframes what deception means in large-scale war. The most effective lie is not false information. It is true information presented in a way that leads to the wrong conclusion. Can this strategy be repeated? Only under very specific conditions. It requires an enemy whose doctrine is rigid, whose leadership is invested in symbolic victory, and whose industrial base cannot sustain prolonged high-intensity loss. It also requires a system willing to convert human and material endurance into strategic capital. When those conditions are absent, this approach becomes catastrophic. Absorbing blows without extracting structural advantage is not strategy. It is slow defeat. Kursk, then, is not a template. It is a warning. It shows what happens when one side adapts its thinking to the realities of industrial war, and the other continues to search for decisive moments that no longer exist. The battle mattered not because it destroyed German forces in a single engagement, but because it marked the point where German command lost the ability to impose its preferred form of war. From that moment on, the conflict moved in only one direction. The final lesson is the hardest to accept. Strategic success does not always look intelligent while it is happening. Sometimes it looks like stubbornness. Sometimes it looks like waste. Sometimes it looks like loss. At Kursk, victory emerged not from brilliance on display, but from a system that understood which assumptions would break first, and was willing to endure long enough to let them break. Because in wars between industrial powers, the side that wins is often not the one that avoids damage, but the one that understands exactly what kind of damage the enemy cannot survive. Kursk is often remembered as a battle of machines. Steel against steel. Numbers against numbers. But that memory misses the core truth. What collapsed at Kursk was not German armor. It was German certainty. The Soviet strategy did not win because it was elegant. It won because it was aligned with the deeper reality of the war that had emerged by 1943. A reality where decisive breakthroughs were no longer guaranteed. Where industrial capacity, replacement rates, and psychological endurance mattered more than operational flair. Where doctrine, once a source of strength, could become a trap. This is why Kursk remains uncomfortable to analyze. It forces a confrontation with the idea that some victories are built not on avoiding loss, but on structuring it. That some systems win not by protecting their forces, but by knowing which losses they can survive, and which losses their enemy cannot. The Soviet command did not predict the future perfectly. They did something colder. They identified which assumptions were least likely to change. German faith in armored decision. German reluctance to disengage once committed. German need for a victory that looked decisive. They did not deceive Germany into making a mistake. They allowed Germany to be itself. That is the quiet violence of correct assumptions. But this strategy also draws a hard boundary. It works only when power structures tolerate delayed validation. When political authority can absorb early failure. When human cost can be translated into strategic time without fracturing the system that authorizes it. Remove any one of those conditions, and the same logic becomes disaster. Kursk does not teach commanders how to fight better. It teaches analysts how to think more dangerously. It warns that the most effective strategies are often those that exploit rigidity rather than weakness, identity rather than error. And it leaves us with a final, unsettling thought. In wars shaped by systems, doctrines, and institutions, the decisive moment may not be the attack, the counterattack, or the breakthrough. It may be the moment one side realizes, too late, that it has been fighting exactly the war its enemy needed it to fight. That is not a lesson about the past. It is a diagnostic tool for the future. And it is why Kursk is not just a battle worth remembering, it is a strategy worth fearing.